Hey everyone, my name is Emma, and you are listening to Revenge Diaries with Emma. Today we are wading into the murky, modern waters of the digital ghosting. You know the feeling, or maybe you don't, and if you don't, consider yourself lucky. It's that specific, cold sweat moment when you type out a message, something perfectly innocent, maybe a link to a funny cat video you just knew they'd love, and you hit send. And instead of the familiar little, delivered, tag, you're met with the stark, void-like emptiness of a single gray tick. No blue ones in sight. It's the digital age equivalent of shouting into a canyon and having the sound just disappear, swallowed whole. No echo, no nothing. It's a silence that is louder than any explosion. It tells you that you have been deemed unworthy of a response, unworthy of even a confrontation. You have been neatly, and with surgical precision, erased. It's a power move, a coward's gambit, a declaration that you are so insignificant you don't even merit the energy it takes to type, "Leave me alone." And it leaves a unique kind of sting, one that doesn't throb like a fresh wound but settles in like a deep, persistent chill. You're left holding the phone, staring at that gray tick, wondering what you did, what you said, when the shift happened. The truth is, sometimes you did nothing at all. Sometimes, you were just a casualty of someone else's internal narrative, a character written out of the script without so much as a notification. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And for fun, drop a comment with your location and your local time. It's always fascinating to see where in the world this little community is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into today's journey together. This is where our story begins. Not with a bang, but with a block. You're going about your day, the sun is out, your coffee is perfectly adequate, and life feels normal. You decide to send a text. It's not a plea, not a declaration of love, not a desperate cry for attention. It's a simple, "Hey, I saw that article and thought of you," or maybe, "Remember that pizza place we went to? I drove by it today." A harmless piece of digital string, a thread connecting you to another person. You tap send. And the world tilts, just a fraction. The message doesn't say, "delivered." It just sits there. You stare. You check your Wi-Fi. It's fine. You check your signal. Full bars. A cold little stone drops into the pit of your stomach. You navigate to their social media profile, the one you've visited 100 times before. Instead of their familiar profile picture, their curated life highlights, you are met with a blank space. A generic silhouette. Nothing. You've been blocked. The initial shock is a physical thing. It's a flush of heat to your face, a sudden tightness in your chest. Your mind, that treacherous organ, immediately starts sprinting through a maze of possibilities. Is it a mistake? A technical glitch? Did they lose their phone? But deep down, in the quiet, rational part of your brain that you're trying very hard to ignore, you know. There was no glitch. This was deliberate. This was a choice. They picked up their digital scalpel and decided to perform an amputation. They cut the thread. And then comes the second wave of emotion, the one that follows the shock and the hurt. It's a slow, simmering heat that starts in your fingertips and works its way inward. It's not just sadness anymore. It's indignation. The sheer audacity of it. The cowardice. To not have the basic human decency to offer a reason, to offer a simple, "This isn't working for me." Instead, they chose the silent treatment, the digital void. They made you a ghost in their machine, and in doing so, they underestimated one crucial thing: a ghost can haunt. A ghost can move through walls. A ghost can flicker the lights and make the temperature drop, They thought they were safe behind their screen, that a block was a fortress wall. They forgot that every wall has a foundation, and foundations can be cracked. You put your phone down. You finish your coffee. The world hasn't ended. The sun is still out. But something has shifted inside you. That cold stone in your stomach isn't just hurt anymore. It's been polished into something harder, something sharper. It's the first, nascent spark of a resolve. They wanted silence? Fine. But silence can be a canvas. And you are just beginning to decide what to paint on it. You look at your reflection in the dark screen of your phone. A small, grim smile touches your lips. They thought blocking you was the end of the story. They were wrong. It was just the end of the prologue. The first move has been made. And now, it's your turn. The initial, cold shock of the block began to thaw, not into sadness, but into a clear, crystalline focus. That little gray tick next to the message, that blank space where a profile used to be, it was no longer a symbol of rejection. It had transformed into a declaration of war, delivered not with a shout, but with a whisper. And you understood, with a chilling clarity, that the quietest battles are often the most brutal. They had made a critical error in judgment. They assumed that by cutting the digital tether, they had rendered you powerless. They saw the block as a full stop, a period at the end of a sentence. But you were already starting to see it as a semicolon. The story wasn't over, it was merely pausing before the next, more interesting clause. The first order of business was intelligence. You couldn't fight an enemy you couldn't see, and you certainly couldn't fight one who thought they were invisible. So, you began to map the terrain of their life from which you had been so unceremoniously ejected. This wasn't about stalking, this was about reconnaissance. You needed to understand the fortress walls, not to admire them, but to find the cracks. You started with the obvious, the places you still had access to. Their professional profile on LinkedIn, for instance. A wonderfully dry and self-important platform where people proudly list all the pillars holding up their public life. Their job title, their colleagues, their projects, the specific, boastful jargon of their industry. It was all there, a treasure map of professional vanity. Then there were the public-facing social media accounts they'd forgotten to lock down, or perhaps felt no need to, believing a simple block on one platform was a universal shield. An Instagram account set to public, filled with carefully filtered photos of expensive cocktails and business-class airport lounges. A Twitter feed where they engaged in loud, performative debates about corporate ethics. Every post, every like, every humble brag was a data point. You learned the names of their close colleagues, the client they were constantly trying to impress, the restaurant they frequented every Thursday, the brand of suit they wore with such pride. You were assembling a jigsaw puzzle of their existence, and the picture that was emerging was one of profound, almost laughable, vulnerability. Their entire life was a house of cards, and they were standing there, grinning, convinced it was made of brick and mortar. A plan didn't form all at once, it accreted, like a pearl around the irritant of their initial betrayal. It started not with grand visions of destruction, but with small, precise questions. What would cause the most inconvenience? Not a catastrophe, not yet, just a ripple. What would chip away at that carefully polished facade of control? What small, inexplicable event would make them frown, check their phone twice, and feel the first, faint whisper of unease? The goal wasn't to launch a nuke, it was to introduce a virus. A slow, creeping malaise into their perfect little world. You remembered a story they'd once told you, laughing about their own fastidiousness. They hated disorder, hated unexpected deliveries, hated anything that disrupted the pristine, scheduled flow of their day. Their assistant was instructed to screen all packages. The memory was like a key clicking in a lock. A small, malicious smile played on your lips. An idea, perfect in its simplicity and its petty inconvenience, bloomed in your mind. It was harmless, really. Almost a joke. But the best jokes always have a sting in the tail, don't they? It would require a prepaid debit card, a VPN to mask your digital footprint, and about 10 minutes of your time. A small investment for the first stone to be cast across the still surface of their pond. You opened a new browser tab, the incognito window a blank slate for your new vocation. This was no longer about hurt feelings. This was a project. A creative undertaking. They had given you the silence, and you were going to fill it with a symphony of their own making, a composition of escalating chaos. The block had been their move. The next move, the first real move of the game, was yours. And it was going to be a delivery. Not a message, not a plea, but a physical, tangible object that would arrive at their sanctum sanctorum, their office, and demand an explanation they would never be able to provide. The blueprint was complete, a phantom architecture existing only in the quiet space behind your eyes. It was a map of pressure points and vulnerabilities, a schematic of a life that was about to become considerably less comfortable. The first move, you had decided, would be a test. A probe sent into the dark to see what kind of echo it would return. It needed to be something that couldn't be traced, something that would cause a specific, localized form of confusion, a single, dissonant note in the otherwise harmonious symphony of their controlled existence. The memory of their near-pathological hatred for unscheduled disruptions was the cornerstone upon which you built your opening gambit. The tool for this task was a subscription. Not to a magazine or a streaming service, but to something far more tangible, far more inconvenient. You settled on a monthly artisanal cheese club. It was perfect. It was absurdly pretentious, which appealed to your sense of irony, and it was physically intrusive. A large, chilled box arriving at a corporate office, requiring immediate retrieval and refrigeration. It would smell. It would demand attention. It would be, for a person who thrived on minimalist efficiency, an absolute nuisance. The execution was a lesson in digital anonymity. A public library computer, a one-time use email address generated through a service that evaporated after 24 hours, a prepaid Visa card bought with cash from a convenience store 3 towns over. You filled in the order form with a sense of detached professionalism. Their full name, their precise work address, the suite number you'd memorized from a LinkedIn post about their offices, inspiring redesign. You even used their actual phone number, the one listed on the company website, ensuring the delivery driver would be able to complete the mission. You clicked confirm order, and the first domino was tipped. The transaction was untraceable, a ghost purchase made by a phantom. The cheese was on its way. The day of the delivery, you allowed yourself a small, private ritual. You made a cup of tea and you watched the clock. You knew their schedule. You knew that at 10:30 a.m., they had a standing departmental meeting, a sacred, unbreakable hour of corporate synergy. At 10:42 a.m., according to the tracking number you'd noted, the package was signed for at the front desk by a J. Miller. You pictured the scene. The receptionist, J. Miller, would have wheeled the heavy, cold box over to their assistant's desk. The assistant, a perpetually flustered young man named Ben whose name you'd gleaned from a tagged company photo, would have been perplexed. He screened all deliveries. He wasn't expecting cheese. He would have checked the order, seen your target's name, and been faced with a dilemma. Interrupt the sacred meeting for a box of gourmet dairy, or let it sit and risk his boss's wrath over a spoiled, smelly package. You imagined the soft knock on the conference room door. The low murmur of conversation halting. The door opening just a crack, revealing Ben's anxious face. The whispered consultation. You pictured them, let's call him Alex for clarity's sake, though you never would, excusing himself, his expression a mask of polite irritation. He would step into the hallway and be confronted by the box. The bold, rustic font of The Curated Way Cheese Club emblazoned on the side. The cold seeping through the cardboard. His confusion would be absolute. He didn't order this. He would never order this. His mind would perform the same frantic gymnastics yours did when you saw the gray tick. A glitch? A gift from a client? But no card. A mistake by the assistant? But Ben would be adamant, the order was in Alex's name, the billing matched. For a full 10 minutes, his meticulously planned day would be derailed by the mystery of the cheese. He'd have to find space in the office kitchen's tiny fridge, displacing someone's sad-looking salad. He'd have to explain it to his colleagues upon returning to the meeting. Everything all right, Alex? Oh, fine, just a delivery. Some cheese. A ripple of confused laughter. The professional veneer, momentarily cracked. It was a small thing, insignificant in the grand scheme. It wouldn't ruin his life. It wouldn't get him fired. But that wasn't the point. The point was the introduction of a variable he could not control. The point was the seed of doubt. Someone, somewhere, had his information and was using it to send him dairy products. It was bizarre. It was illogical. It was the psychological equivalent of a single, persistent mosquito in a silent room. A tiny, buzzing annoyance that would break his concentration and make him look, for just a moment, slightly foolish. He would dismiss it, of course. Write it off as a weird fluke, a clerical error by some food subscription service. He would have the cheese thrown out, or perhaps, in a moment of waste not whimsy, take it home. He would move on. But the ripple was now moving through the pond. And you were already preparing the next stone. The cheese, you presumed, had been dealt with. Eaten, discarded, or perhaps re-gifted in a moment of bewildered charity. The ripple would have subsided, the surface of their pond smoothing over once more. Alex would have chalked it up to a bizarre anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of his otherwise orderly life. The block on your number was still in place, his digital walls seemingly intact. He felt secure. This was the most crucial part of the process, allowing the target to believe the momentary strangeness was just that, momentary. Complacency was your greatest ally. A vigilant enemy is a hard target, a comfortable one is a sitting duck. While he was dismissing the dairy incident, you were already accessing the next node in his public network. His LinkedIn profile remained a glaring vulnerability, a monument to his professional self-regard. It was all there, polished to a high sheen, the headline proclaiming him a visionary leader in strategic synergy, the list of endorsements for skills like operational excellence and stakeholder engagement, the photo of him in that sharp, navy blue suit. It was a fortress of vanity, but its gate was unlocked. A few careful, almost surgical alterations could turn this monument into a monument to absurdity. You didn't want to destroy it. Destruction is obvious, crude. You wanted to subtly warp it, to make it ever so slightly off. The goal was to undermine his credibility not with a sledgehammer, but with a whisper, to make colleagues and clients do a double take, to plant a seed of doubt about his professionalism, his attention to detail, his sanity. You logged into a dummy account you'd created weeks prior for just such a purpose, the profile of a generic, friendly-looking HR professional named Mark. Using a public Wi-Fi network from a coffee shop, you began the delicate work of social sabotage. First, the skills. You navigated to the section where his connections could endorse him. With a few clicks, Mark generously endorsed Alex for a new set of competencies. Candle making. 17th century French poetry. Advanced cartoon voice impressions. These were nestled in among the legitimate endorsements for data analysis and public speaking. It created a bizarre juxtaposition. Any recruiter or client scanning his profile would be met with the strange spectacle of a corporate strategist who was also, apparently, an expert in artisanal wax and the works of Racine. It was just odd enough to be memorable for all the wrong reasons. Next, the headline. You couldn't change it directly, but you could suggest an edit, a feature designed for crowdsourcing accuracy, now perverted into a tool for gentle mockery. You suggested a minor but significant alteration. From visionary leader in strategic synergy to visionary leader in strategic synergy and paranormal investigations. You wrote a polite note in the edit box. Hey Alex, you forgot to add your side hustle. Thought I'd help out. Best, Mark. The change wouldn't happen automatically. He would receive a notification and would, of course, reject it. But the point wasn't the change itself. The point was the notification. It was the second inexplicable event. First the cheese, now a random connection altering his professional profile to include ghost hunting. He would dismiss Mark, block the profile, and delete the suggestion, his fingers perhaps moving a little faster than usual, a faint crease of annoyance forming between his brows. The final touch was the most subtle, and therefore the most potent. You navigated to the contact info section, which was publicly visible. His email was listed professionally, Alex, last name, @thecompany.com. You used the suggest and edit function once more. You added a new, secondary email address, alex.loves.kittens.123@aol.com. The juvenile, dated email handle, juxtaposed with his corporate title, was a masterpiece of minor humiliation. Again, he would get a notification and delete it. But the seed was planted. Someone was in his systems. Someone was toying with him. He would tell himself it was a spam campaign, a coordinated effort by bots. He would tighten his privacy settings, muttering about the indignities of the modern internet. But in the quiet of his mind, in the moment before sleep, a sliver of doubt would wedge itself. The cheese was physical. The LinkedIn edits were targeted. They knew his name, his workplace, his profile. It felt personal. But who? He would run through a mental list of disgruntled former colleagues, a jilted date, a rival. Your name, you were sure, would not even flicker on that list. You were erased, remember? A ghost. And ghosts, as he was learning, are very, very good at moving through walls. A week passed. The phantom cheese was a forgotten anecdote, the strange LinkedIn edits a resolved nuisance. Alex had tightened his digital security, his momentary unease soothed by the simple, logical explanation of a random spam attack. Life recalibrated to its normal, predictable rhythm. This was the lull you had intended, the deliberate pause that made the next note of the symphony so much more jarring. You watched, from a distance, as his social media posts returned to their usual cadence, a photo of a sleek new watch, a retweet of an industry article, a check-in at the upscale gym he used as much for networking as for exercise. The facade was back, solid and gleaming. He felt secure again, the king of his little castle, the dust from the recent, minor tremors thoroughly swept away. This was the most delicate phase of the operation. It required patience, a quality you found you possessed in surprising abundance when fueled by a sense of poetic justice. You weren't just causing chaos, you were composing it. And every good composition needs its moments of silence, its rests, to give the subsequent crescendo its full impact. You spent this time not in idleness, but in deeper observation. You noted the small tells. His tweets became slightly more frequent, a little more performatively cheerful, as if he were convincing himself, and the world, that all was well. He posted a meme about weird stuff happening on the internet, a vague, communal gripe that was really a personal sigh of relief. He was normalizing the anomalies, filing them away in the cabinet of life's minor irritations. Perfect. It was time to reintroduce the inexplicable. The goal now was to shift the attacks from the digital periphery to the physical world once more, but with a twist that would make the cheese delivery look like a friendly greeting card. You remembered his pride and joy, his metallic blue sports car. He spoke of it not as transportation, but as a member of his family. He had a specific, almost ritualistic way of parking it in the secure, underground lot of his apartment building, always in the same spot, far from any other vehicle to avoid door dings. You knew the make, the model, the license plate. It was another pillar of his identity, another point of vanity. And vanity, as you were learning, is always a weakness. The plan was simple, cost nothing, and was exquisitely annoying. Using a different prepaid phone, you signed up for every single free car insurance quote website, every local dealership promotion, every win a dream car contest you could find. You filled out the forms with meticulous accuracy, his name, his address, his cell phone number, the specific make and model of his beloved car. You requested contact. You asked for salespeople to call him. You indicated he was very interested in trading in his current vehicle. The first call came 2 days later, while he was likely in his car, driving to work. You could picture the moment. The Bluetooth system in his pristine cabin would connect, the caller ID showing a local dealership. He'd answer, polite but confused. "Hello, Alex. This is Sarah from Premier Auto Mall. I understand you're looking to trade in your M4? He would dismiss it, a wrong number, a data broker selling his information. Annoying, but part of modern life. Then another call, an hour later, from a different dealership. Then a text. Then an email to his primary account. By lunchtime, his phone would have become a chorus of unsolicited automotive interest. He would start to feel hunted. This wasn't random spam, it was targeted. They knew his car. They knew his number. They were calling him, intruding into his sanctum, the very cockpit of his prized possession. He would change his number, a drastic and deeply inconvenient step. But you were prepared for that. You had already signed him up for a second wave of quotes using his work number, the one listed on the company website. The siege would simply shift fronts. The confusion would curdle into a low-grade paranoia. The anomalies were no longer isolated. They were a pattern. The cheese, the LinkedIn, now the car. 3 separate domains of his life, nourishment, profession, passion, had been touched by this invisible, mocking hand. He was no longer the king of his castle, he was a lord whose lands were being haunted by a poltergeist. And the poltergeist was just warming up. The low-grade hum of paranoia was now a permanent fixture in Alex's life, a dissonant chord underlying his every move. Changing his personal number had been a hassle, but it provided a brief, illusory sense of security. That illusion was shattered when the calls started coming to his direct office line. His assistant, Ben, would transfer them through with a hesitant, "It's another car dealership, Alex. Should I?" He'd have to take the call, his voice tight with a forced politeness, explaining it was a mistake, a prank, to please remove his number. Each call was a tiny puncture in his professional armor. You could almost hear the hiss of escaping composure. It was time to escalate. The previous actions were probes, tests of his security and his sanity. They were the opening movements, establishing the theme. Now, it was time for the first real performance. You needed an act that would have tangible, financial consequences, something that couldn't be dismissed as a digital glitch or a spam campaign. You needed to hit him in his wallet and his reputation simultaneously. The answer came from a memory, one he'd shared with you in a moment of unguarded bragging. His birthday was in 3 weeks. He'd once laughed about a colleague who'd had a surprise party thrown for him at the Aviary, a notoriously exclusive, sky-high rooftop bar known for its panoramic city views and its eye-watering prices. "Can you imagine the bill?" he'd said, shaking his head with a mixture of pity and superiority. The poor sap probably had to take out a loan. You could imagine it quite clearly, actually. And you decided he wouldn't have to imagine for much longer. The aviary's website was a masterpiece of minimalist design and maximum exclusivity. They offered curated event experiences. You navigated to their inquiry form. This required a more sophisticated approach than the cheese club or the insurance quotes. This required a persona. You became Eleanor, a supposedly high-end personal assistant working for a demanding, anonymous client. You used a new, professional-looking email address and a secure messaging app number. Your language was crisp, efficient, and laced with the subtle arrogance of someone used to having their requests fulfilled without question. Your inquiry to the aviary was a work of art. You explained that your client, a Mr. Alex, last name, wished to book his birthday celebration. He was expecting 50 guests. He wanted the premium package, the private glass-enclosed terrace, the top-shelf open bar for 5 hours, the extensive gourmet catering menu featuring Wagyu sliders and truffle-infused everything, the dedicated mixologist, the live jazz trio. You stressed his importance, his discerning taste, his expectation of flawless service. You provided his correct cell phone number, the new one he'd just gotten, as the primary contact, and his work email for the confirmation. You then, crucially, stated that Mr. last name would be handling all billing details directly and would provide his credit card information upon his confirmation of the final proposal. The events manager at the aviary, a woman named Isabel according to her email signature, was predictably enthusiastic. Within hours, a beautifully rendered PDF proposal landed in Alex's work inbox. The subject line: confirmation of proposal for your aviary birthday celebration. The total at the bottom was a number that could comfortably cover a small used car. You pictured the moment he opened it. The confusion, quickly followed by dawning horror. He would call Isabel immediately, his voice likely a notch too high. There's been a mistake. I didn't book this. Isabel, her tone cooling several degrees, would reference her correspondence with Eleanor. She would read back the specifics, the 50 guests, the Wagyu sliders, the jazz trio. She would explain that while they understood mix-ups happened, a venue of their caliber had to hold dates for serious inquiries, and this had been a very serious inquiry indeed. There would be a tense back and forth. He would be forced to insist, repeatedly and with growing embarrassment, that he was not, in fact, throwing a party. He would have to proclaim his own lack of celebration to a stranger who was now probably doubting both his sanity and his solvency. He would hang up, his heart hammering. He'd stare at the proposal, at that astronomical number. This was no longer a prank call. This was a financial threat, a brush with a debt he had not incurred. It was also a deep, personal embarrassment. The story of the mistaken, lavish party booking would be a humiliation if it ever got out. He would feel the eyes of the city upon him, judging him for his presumption or his poverty. The block on your number was a flimsy shield against this. You weren't trying to call him, you were trying to become him. You were using his identity as a weapon against himself. The ghost wasn't just flickering the lights anymore. It was starting to rearrange the furniture, and it had expensive taste. The phone call with Isabel from the aviary had been a special kind of torture. It wasn't just the shock of the proposed bill, it was the condescending pity in her voice, the subtle shift from fawning service to brisk professionalism as she realized he wasn't a high roller but a problem. He had managed to cancel it, his voice tight with a humiliation that burned in his ears, insisting it was a fraudulent request. Isabel had said she would note it in their system, a phrase that sounded ominously like being blacklisted. He hung up, his palms damp. This was coordinated. The cheese, the LinkedIn, the car calls, now this. Someone was orchestrating this. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. He did what any modern, rational person would do, he went digital. He scanned his email for phishing attempts, changed every password he could think of, ran malware scans on all his devices. He found nothing. The attacks were not coming from a virus, they were coming from a mind. They were using public information and perfectly legitimate services as their weapons. How do you firewall against that? His frustration was a physical pressure behind his eyes. He found himself scrutinizing every interaction, every face in his office. Was it Ben, the assistant, harboring some secret resentment? Was it that guy from accounting he'd beaten out for a promotion last year? The paranoia was a fog, making every shadow seem threatening. This internal chaos was the intended effect. While he was lost in the labyrinth of his own suspicion, you were preparing the next, more devastating move. The aviary incident had been a warning shot across his financial bow. Now, it was time to make it personal. Not just inconvenient, not just embarrassing, but deeply, intimately personal. You had been observing a new development in his digital life. A woman named Chloe. Her name had started appearing in the comments of his Instagram posts. A like here, a flirty emoji there. A new follower, her profile private but her bio hinting at a life of yoga and art galleries. He had liked several of her posts in return. A new romance, or the hopeful beginnings of one. A fresh source of validation, a new audience for his carefully curated self. It was the perfect new front to open. You couldn't access her private profile, but you didn't need to. You could create the narrative from the outside. Using another anonymous email account, you crafted a message. This one was not from a business, but from a person. A concerned, slightly unhinged person. The tone was key, it had to be just credible enough to sow doubt, but just off-kilter enough to make Alex dismiss it as the work of a crazy ex, while simultaneously making Chloe view him as the source of the drama. The email was sent to Chloe's address, which you had found through a professional directory linked in a tweet from a conference she'd attended. The subject line was, "A word about Alex." The body of the message was a masterpiece of plausible insanity. "Hi Chloe," it began. "I know we don't know each other, and I'm so sorry to intrude like this, but I saw you're connected with Alex and I felt I had to reach out. I'm not a jealous ex, I promise, that's his narrative, not mine. I'm just someone who cares about people not getting hurt. He's a charmer, I know. But please, just be careful. He has a way of creating these elaborate fictions and then blocking you when you no longer fit the script. He told me he was taking a break from dating to focus on his career, but I see that's not the case. I just don't want you to be the next one he ghosts after making all these promises. He's not who he seems. Again, so sorry to be the bearer of this, but my conscience wouldn't let me stay silent. Take care." It was perfect. It presented you as a concerned third party, not a spurned lover. It used his actual behavior, the blocking, as evidence of his unreliability. It painted him as a liar without making any specific, falsifiable claims. Most importantly, it reframed his greatest weapon, the silent block, as a pattern of toxic behavior. Chloe would receive this and be faced with a choice. Confront him, which would force him into a defensive, humiliating explanation about a crazy person harassing him, or, more likely, she would simply pull back, her interest cooled by the sudden whiff of drama. Either way, the budding connection would be tainted. The ghost had now learned to speak, and its words were designed to poison his well. The fortress of his life was under a multi-pronged assault, and the most recently constructed wall, his new, hopeful romance, was the first to show a critical crack. The foundation was cracking. You knew it not from any grand announcement, but from the subtle, telltale shifts in the digital landscape you monitored so closely. Alex's social media posts, once a steady stream of curated confidence, developed a jagged, defensive edge. He posted a meme about haters fueling your success, another about not letting negativity live rent-free in your head. He was trying to project strength, but the effort was visible, like sweat beading on a brow. The performance was for himself as much as for anyone else. He was trying to convince the world, and perhaps himself, that he was unshaken. But you could see the tremors. His interactions with Chloe's profile ceased entirely. The likes on her photos stopped. The flirty comment threads vanished, likely deleted. The silence between their digital selves was deafening. Your concerned email had done its work. Whether she had confronted him or had simply ghosted him preemptively, the result was the same: a connection severed, a source of potential happiness extinguished. He was now alone inside the fortress, the drawbridge pulled up, but the walls were no longer feeling like protection. They felt like a cage. This isolation was a critical component of the plan. A person with a strong support system can weather storms. They have people to reassure them, to offer alternative explanations, to share the burden. A person who is isolated, whose new romantic interest has just fled at the first sign of trouble, has only the echo chamber of their own paranoia for company. His colleagues would have noticed the increased tension, the shorter temper, the way he jumped when his office phone rang. The easygoing corporate warrior persona was fraying, revealing the anxious man underneath. It was time to move from the personal to the profoundly professional. The cheese was a nuisance, the fake party an embarrassment, the sabotage romance a personal blow. But his career, his status, his financial security, that was the core of his identity. That was the pillar that, if cracked, would bring the entire temple down around him. You had identified his most important client, a major tech firm referred to in a press release as Ether Innovations. His LinkedIn was filled with posts subtly name-dropping his work with them, the crown jewel in his professional portfolio. Their project with his company was in its final, critical phase. This was the moment to strike. The weapon would be email. Not a virus, not a hack, but simple, old-fashioned forgery. You created a new email address, one that was a near-perfect mirror of his work address. Instead of alex.lastname@thecompany.com, you made alex.iastname@thecompany.com, substituting a capital I for the lowercase l. To a cursory glance, it was identical. From this address, you composed an email to his main point of contact at Ether Innovations, a woman named Priya Sharma, whose name and email you had found in a CC'd thread on a public industry forum. The email was short, unprofessional, and brilliantly damaging. Priya, it began, a faux pas in familiarity. Need to push back the final deliverable by 2 weeks. Our internal team is swamped and frankly, the specs from your end have been a moving target. It's creating a lot of unnecessary rework on our side. Let me know when you've cleared the new timeline with your stakeholders. Thanks, Alex. It was a masterpiece of professional sabotage. It shifted blame directly onto the client. It used the condescending phrase, moving target. It implied the client was disorganized and a poor communicator. Most egregiously, it demanded the client do the work of rescheduling, a profound breach of account management etiquette. You hit send. The reaction was not immediate, but you could imagine it brewing. Priya, a high-level executive, would receive this and her blood would run cold, then hot. The audacity. The unprofessionalism. She would forward it to her team with a terse, "What is this?" She would likely call Alex directly, her voice icy. He would be blindsided. He would have no record of sending such an email. He would stammer, deny it, claim his email must have been hacked. He would sound desperate, unreliable. The trust, the carefully cultivated professional relationship that was the bedrock of the project, would be shattered in a single, confusing phone call. He would spend the rest of the day in damage control mode, sending frantic, apologetic emails from his legitimate account, trying to prove his innocence, looking less like a visionary leader and more like a man who was losing control of his own digital footprint. The ghost had just walked into his most important meeting and poured coffee all over the presentation. The fallout from the fake email to Ether Innovations was a wildfire, and you had a front row seat to the smoke signals. Alex's professional profile, once a placid lake of corporate achievement, suddenly churned with activity. He posted a vague, defensive update about the importance of clear communication and verifying sources in the digital age. It was a desperate attempt to control the narrative, a life raft thrown out to his professional network. More tellingly, his activity on job-seeking platforms, which had been dormant for months, spiked. He was updating his resume, browsing listings. The damage from the single email had been catastrophic. Priya Sharma had not taken the message lightly. The project was now under review, and his company's leadership was involved. The crown jewel of his portfolio was tarnished, possibly beyond repair. He was now in full crisis mode, a state of being you had meticulously engineered. The isolated annoyances had coalesced into a unified front of catastrophe. His personal life was in tatters, his professional reputation was under siege, and his mental state was clearly fraying. You could see it in the hastiness of his posts, the frantic energy radiating from his digital presence. He was a man swinging a bat at a swarm of bees, accomplishing nothing but his own exhaustion. This was the descent. The controlled, strategic pressure had pushed him over the edge from confused irritation into genuine chaos. He was no longer trying to solve a puzzle, he was just trying to survive the avalanche. It was in this state of heightened vulnerability that you chose to make your first direct contact. Not a call, not a text, those were still blocked, a fortress he still believed was secure. You needed a method that would bypass his defenses and land directly in the heart of his new, chaotic reality. You remembered a detail from long ago, a throwaway comment about his gym bag. He kept a spare key to his apartment in a small, magnetic box stuck to the inside frame of his car's trunk, a habit from a time he'd locked himself out. It was a stupid, reckless security flaw, the kind of thing a person who feels invulnerable does. He had never felt the need to change it. A plan, audacious and intimate, took shape. It was time for the ghost to leave a calling card. Using the prepaid phone, you ordered a single, specific item, a small, cheap, plastic toy from a children's meal at a fast food chain. A little cartoon figure. It was innocuous, meaningless, and therefore, profoundly unsettling. The next part was the risk. You needed to place it inside his home. You waited for a Thursday, his late night at the office day. Dressed in nondescript clothing, a baseball cap pulled low, you went to his apartment building. It was an older, respectable place with a lobby that required a key fob, but the underground parking garage was accessible. You walked in behind another car, your heart a steady, determined drum in your chest. You found his metallic blue sports car, parked in its usual, proud isolation. A quick glance around confirmed the garage was empty. With gloves on, you popped the trunk using the external release. There, just as remembered, was the small, gray magnetic box. Inside, the spare key. Letting yourself into his apartment was a surreal violation. It was exactly as you'd imagined, clean, minimalist, and cold. A showroom, not a home. You didn't touch anything. You didn't rifle through drawers. You simply walked to the center of his living room, placed the cheap plastic toy on his pristine glass coffee table, and turned to leave. As you did, your eyes caught a photograph on a shelf. It was of him, smiling with a group of friends from a happier time. You felt a flicker of something, not remorse, but a cold confirmation. This was the person who had thought so little of you that erasure was his only response. You turned, locked the door behind you, and returned the key to its hiding place. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. The next day, he would come home, exhausted from fighting professional fires. He would walk into his living room, his sanctuary, and he would see it. A small, brightly colored piece of plastic sitting where no such thing should be. His mind would reject it at first. Then, the cold, gut-wrenching realization would dawn. Someone had been here. Inside his home. They had a key. They had walked through his space while he was gone. They had left a token. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't threatening in any conventional sense. But it was a message more terrifying than any threat: I am everywhere. Your car, your job, your home. There is no fortress. There are no walls. I see you. The psychological line had been crossed. This was no longer a campaign of annoyance, it was a demonstration of absolute, terrifying access. The discovery of the toy on his coffee table was the breaking point. The carefully constructed dam of his rationality, already strained by professional sabotage and personal humiliation, finally shattered. The feeling was no longer one of being targeted, it was one of being consumed. The entity haunting him wasn't just outside the walls anymore, it was in the very air he breathed. He spent that night in a state of hypervigilance, checking locks repeatedly, jumping at the normal creaks and groans of his apartment building. He took the toy, not as a harmless trinket, but as a totem of profound violation, and threw it in the garbage, only to fish it out minutes later, as if it were evidence in a crime he couldn't name. Sleep was impossible. The world had become a hostile place, every shadow a potential threat, every silent moment a prelude to the next, inexplicable strike. The following morning, haggard and running on nerves alone, he did what he should have done weeks ago, but with a frantic, desperate energy. He called a locksmith to change every lock on his apartment door. He scheduled an appointment with a cybersecurity firm, ranting to the patient consultant about a sophisticated harassment campaign. He was no longer trying to solve a puzzle, he was building a bunker. He posted a frantic, since-deleted tweet about digital stalkers and the collapse of personal privacy, a cry into the void that was met with a handful of concerned replies and a wave of silent judgment. He was publicly unraveling, and the performance of control was now completely abandoned. The polished corporate warrior was gone, replaced by a haunted, paranoid man. This was the intended effect. A target who is panicking is a target who makes mistakes. He was so focused on the physical breach of his home, on the grand, dramatic gestures, that he became blind to the subtler, more insidious avenues of attack. While he was reinforcing his front door, you were quietly picking the lock on his back. His social circles, for instance. You had a list of names, colleagues, acquaintances, the friends from that photograph on his shelf. It was time to spread the contagion. Using another anonymous, untraceable account, you began sending messages. Not long, ranting accusations, but short, cryptic warnings. To a colleague, be careful what you share with Alex. His loyalties aren't what they seem. To an old university friend, heard you're still in touch with Alex. You might want to ask him about what happened with the ether deal. The messages were vague, poison-tipped darts designed to provoke questions and sow distrust. They didn't need to be believed, they only needed to be seen. When his friends or colleagues would inevitably ask him, "Hey, what's this about?" or "Are you okay, man?" "I got a weird message," he would have no good answer. He would have to either confess that he was the victim of a bizarre campaign, making him look unstable, or invent a lie, making him look shady. Either way, the bonds of trust were being weakened. His world was shrinking. The professional front was collapsing under the weight of the ether scandal. The personal front was now compromised by the violation of his home. The social front was being methodically poisoned. He was a general whose army was deserting, whose supply lines were cut, whose command tent had been infiltrated. The ghost was no longer just haunting him, it was dismantling his life, piece by piece, relationship by relationship. He sat in his newly secured apartment, the fresh metal of the locks gleaming, and felt more trapped than ever. The enemy wasn't outside the door. The enemy was in the system. The enemy was the silence on his blocked messages list, a silence that had become deafeningly, terrifyingly loud. He was starting to understand that he wasn't just being attacked, he was being curated. His ruin was being carefully, artistically arranged. The fortress was now a prison. The new locks on the door felt less like a barrier and more like a confirmation of his own captivity. The frantic calls to cybersecurity firms had yielded nothing. They found no malware, no breaches of his personal devices. The enemy, they told him, was not in his machine, but in the world, using the world's own tools against him. This was a cold comfort. It meant there was no patch, no update, no simple fix. The poison messages to his friends had done their work. His phone was quieter. Invitations to after-work drinks had dried up. The concerned looks from colleagues had morphed into careful avoidance. He was becoming a pariah, a carrier of some social contagion that sensible people knew to steer clear of. He was adrift in a sea of his own anxiety, and in this state, his mind, desperate for a lifeline, for a face to put to the fear, finally began to circle back. It retraced the steps of the entire, bizarre ordeal, from the first, inexplicable cheese to the toy on his coffee table. He thought of the people he'd wronged, the bridges he'd burned with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he was always moving upward. A disgruntled former employee? A business rival? A random stranger he'd cut off in traffic? The list was depressingly long. And then, as if emerging from a deep fog, a memory surfaced. The block. The simple, clean, decisive act of blocking a number. It had felt so final, so absolute. An end. But what if it wasn't an end? What if it was a beginning? The thought was at first too ridiculous to entertain. She was insignificant. Quiet. The kind of person who accepted being ghosted. She didn't have the spine for something like this. She didn't have the resources, the cunning. But then, he remembered things. Offhand comments she'd made that revealed a startling attention to detail. A quiet wit that could be surprisingly sharp. A resilience he'd mistaken for passivity. The more he thought about it, the more the seemingly random attacks began to cohere into a pattern that felt personal. The cheese, he'd once laughed about his hatred for unexpected deliveries in front of her. The LinkedIn edits, they had a specific, almost witty cruelty that felt conversational. The ether email, it used a phrase, moving target, that he'd complained about using in a team meeting, a meeting she knew about because he'd taken the call at her apartment. A cold, sickening dread washed over him, far colder than the fear of a random stalker. This was calculated. This was intimate. This was a response. The block hadn't been a full stop, it had been a spark. He had thrown a stone into a well, thinking it was bottomless, and now, after a long, silent fall, he was finally hearing the echo. And the echo was the sound of his own life cracking apart. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling. He navigated to his blocked contacts list. There it was. Her number. A digital tombstone. His finger hovered over the unblock button. What would he even say? What could he possibly say? The sheer, terrifying genius of her campaign left him breathless. She hadn't screamed or threatened. She had simply demonstrated. She had shown him, with brutal efficiency, that the power he thought he wielded was an illusion. He was just a man, and his life was just a collection of fragile things. And she had broken them all, one by one, without ever saying a word. The realization was a sucker punch to the soul, leaving him winded and hollow. It wasn't a faceless entity or a random act of cosmic spite. It was her. The quiet one. The one he had deemed unworthy of an explanation, unworthy of even a proper goodbye. The memory of that final act, the tap on the screen, the satisfying click of the block function, now felt like the stupidest, most arrogant mistake of his life. He had not silenced a nuisance, he had awakened a strategist. The chaos wasn't random, it was a meticulously crafted critique of his entire existence. The cheese was a comment on his rigidity. The fake party was a mockery of his vanity. The sabotage romance was an indictment of his superficiality. The professional sabotage was an attack on his pride. The toy in his home was the final, terrifying period on the sentence, "I see all of you, and I find you lacking." A frantic, desperate energy seized him. He unblocked her number. His thumb, which had once moved with such dismissive finality, now hovered over the call button, shaking. He had to talk to her. He had to make her stop. He had to, what? Apologize? Explain? Beg? The sheer impotence of his position was a galling humiliation. He was the one who had held all the power, and now he was about to plead for mercy from the person he had cast aside. He took a deep, ragged breath and pressed call. The phone didn't even ring. It went straight to a generic voicemail greeting. "The person you're calling is not available." The message was the digital age equivalent of a closed door. She had blocked him back. The symmetry was perfect, and utterly devastating. The fortress walls he had built to keep her out were now the very walls that kept him trapped inside, alone with the consequences. He couldn't even scream his frustration into her ear. He was mute, and she was the one holding the microphone. Panic turned to a cold, sharp fury. Fine. If she wanted a war, she would get one. He would expose her. He would go to the police. He started compiling a file, a dossier of her crimes. The cheese receipt, he'd had Ben fish it out of the recycling. Screenshots of the altered LinkedIn profile. The email from the aviary. The call logs from the dealerships. The fake email to Ether Innovations. The testimonies of his friends who'd received the weird messages. The toy, which he had kept in a plastic bag like a piece of evidence. He laid it all out on his kitchen table, a chaotic mosaic of harassment. He felt a surge of vindication. This was a clear pattern. This was illegal. He would ruin her. But as he stared at the collection, his certainty began to curdle. The cheese was an unsolicited gift, not a threat. The LinkedIn edits were suggestions from a fake profile, easily dismissed as spam. The aviary booking was made by a Eleanor, with no direct link to her. The car calls were from legitimate businesses. The email to Ether was sent from a spoofed address. The messages to his friends were anonymous. The toy in his apartment, how could he prove it was her? He had no evidence, only a gut feeling. He had no witnesses. He had no digital footprint leading back to her. To an outsider, it would look like a string of bizarre coincidences and minor misfortunes happening to a deeply paranoid man. If he went to the authorities with this, he wouldn't look like a victim, he would look unhinged. The fury bled away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had outmaneuvered him completely. She had constructed a labyrinth with no center, a game with no opponent visible on the board. He could swing and swing, but he would only ever hit air. He put his head in his hands. The ghost had won. It had taken everything from him, his peace of mind, his reputation, his new relationship, his professional standing, and it had done so without ever showing its face. The most terrifying monster is not the one that charges you, but the one that makes you destroy yourself. And he was doing a very thorough job of it. The silence was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the silence of a phone that would not ring, of friends who had drifted away, of a career that had stalled and was now actively backsliding. The official reprimand from his company's HR department sat in his email inbox, a cold, formal document regarding the unprofessional communication with a key client. They had taken Ether's side, of course. The spoofed email was the final straw. His judgment was now in question. He was being encouraged to take a leave of absence while the matter was fully investigated. It was corporate speak for being put out to pasture. The vision of his corner office, his name on the door, evaporated into the thin, toxic air of his apartment. He was a ghost in his own life. He wandered from room to room, the new locks on the door feeling less like security and more like the bars of a cell he had paid to have installed himself. He stopped shaving. The curated gym selfies ceased. The world, his world, had moved on without him. The attacks, too, had ceased. There were no more mysterious deliveries, no more strange emails, no more cryptic messages to his friends. The haunting was over. But that was somehow worse. The constant, escalating pressure had become a perverse kind of companionship, a proof that he was still significant enough to be targeted. Now, there was nothing. Just the empty, echoing aftermath. She had said all she needed to say. The symphony of chaos was complete, and the final note had been the sound of his own collapse. This was the true masterpiece of her revenge. It wasn't the financial cost or the professional damage, though those were severe. It was the isolation. It was the forced introspection. He was alone with the man he had become, and the view was horrifying. He saw the casual cruelties, the towering ego, the profound carelessness with which he had treated other people. The block hadn't been an isolated incident, it had been the purest expression of his character. He had treated a human being as a piece of digital clutter, to be cleared away with a tap. And she had shown him, with breathtaking clarity, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that philosophy. She had deconstructed his life with the same dismissive efficiency with which he had dismissed her. He thought about trying to rebuild. He could find another job, eventually, probably a step down. He could reach out to his friends, explain the whole sordid tale. But the energy for it was gone. The fight had been drained out of him. Every potential path forward was shadowed by the knowledge of what had happened. How could he trust a new colleague? How could he start a new relationship? How could he ever feel secure in his own home again? She hadn't just broken his present, she had poisoned his future. The ghost would be in the room for every job interview, every first date, every quiet moment of peace. It had become a permanent resident in his psyche. He sat in the dark, the glow of his laptop the only light in the room. He navigated to her social media, the one public profile she still maintained. There were no triumphant posts, no gloating updates. There was just life. A photo of a sunset. A shared article about a book. A picture of a coffee cup on a table. She was living. She had moved on. The entire campaign of vengeance had been, for her, a project. A messy, necessary bit of emotional business that was now concluded. She had administered the cure for his toxicity, and the cure had nearly killed him, but she was not his nurse. She was not waiting around to see if he recovered. She was free. And he was in ruins, a monument to his own arrogance, crumbling in the silence she had left behind. Weeks bled into a muted, gray month. The leave of absence from work became a permanent separation, wrapped in the polite, legal language of a mutual agreement. There was no fight left in him. The man who had once thrived on competition and corporate warfare was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out version who jumped at the sound of the mail slot. He spent his days in a state of suspended animation, the world moving past his windows in a blur of color and sound from which he felt completely disconnected. The initial, frantic terror had subsided, leaving behind a thick, heavy residue of despair. This was his life now. This was the aftermath. The campaign was over. You had watched the final act play out with a detached sense of closure. The professional ruin was complete. The social exile was self-enforcing. The personal spirit was broken. There were no more moves to make, no more pillars left to topple. The structure had collapsed in on itself, and all that remained was dust. You felt no triumphant glee, no burning satisfaction. It was a quieter, colder emotion, like the feeling after finishing a difficult, necessary piece of work. A problem had been identified, a solution had been engineered, and the result was a stable, if desolate, equilibrium. He was neutralized. You knew he understood. The silence from his end was the most profound confirmation. There were no more desperate attempts to contact you, no legal threats, no public rants. He had accepted his fate. He had traced the line of cause and effect from the simple, arrogant tap of a block button to the complex ruin of his present. The karma was not a mystical force, it was a chain reaction he had initiated himself. You were merely the instrument that ensured every single link snapped in sequence. He had handed you the blueprint to his own destruction the moment he decided your feelings were irrelevant. All you did was follow the plans. One evening, as a slow, drizzling rain painted his windows in streaks of reflected city light, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He cleaned. Not the perfunctory tidying of a man maintaining a showroom, but a deep, cathartic purge. He boxed up the expensive suits that smelled of boardrooms and ambition. He took down the pretentious art prints. He threw out the fancy coffee machine that required a manual to operate. He stripped his life down to its bare essentials, as if trying to shed the skin of the person who had attracted such calamity. In a drawer, he found the plastic bag containing the cheap toy. He didn't fling it away in anger this time. He held it in his palm, this tiny, brightly colored symbol of his absolute defeat. It was just a piece of molded plastic, mass-produced and utterly worthless. And yet, it had been the key that unlocked his understanding of his own fragility. He placed it back in the drawer, not as a trophy of his fear, but as a reminder. A gravestone for the man he used to be. He would likely move away soon. Get a smaller, cheaper apartment in a different city. Find a simple, undemanding job. His life would be smaller, quieter, infinitely less shiny. But it would, perhaps, be more real. The ghost had not just haunted him, it had exorcised him. It had driven out the demon of his own ego. The price for that exorcism had been everything he thought mattered. But as he looked around the near-empty apartment, the rain whispering against the glass, he felt the first faint, foreign sensation he'd felt in months. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't peace. But it was the absence of terror. It was a blank space. And for now, that was enough. The final act of the campaign was not an attack, but an observation. From a distance, you watched the digital footprint of his old life fade. The LinkedIn profile was set to private, then deleted altogether. The Instagram account, once a vibrant tapestry of curated success, went dark. The Twitter rants about privacy were gone. It was as if the person you had known had been digitally erased, a neat, ironic bookend to how he had tried to erase you. He had become the ghost. He moved out of the apartment with the new locks, leaving no forwarding address with anyone who might talk. The metallic blue sports car was sold, the proceeds likely funding his quieter, anonymous existence. The story of Alex, the rising corporate star, was over. The epilogue was being written by a stranger in a smaller city, a man who had learned the hard way that the quietest people often have the longest memories. Your work was done. The balance had been restored, not by fate or divine intervention, but by meticulous, human effort. The block had been a message of absolute dismissal, and your response had been a dissertation on consequence. You had taken his silence and filled it with such a resonant, devastating echo that it had shattered the very foundations of his world. He had thought the block was a weapon of control, but you had demonstrated that true control isn't about silencing others, it's about understanding the levers of power in someone's life and knowing which ones to pull. You hadn't just gotten revenge, you had delivered a lesson. A brutal, unforgiving lesson, but one he had desperately needed to learn. The entire experience left you with a strange sense of clarity. The hot, sharp pain of the initial betrayal was gone, cooled and hardened into a permanent piece of your understanding of the world. You didn't feel vengeful anymore, you felt educated. You had looked into the abyss of another person's capacity for casual cruelty, and instead of falling in, you had learned to navigate its edges. You had discovered resources within yourself, patience, strategy, creativity, that you never knew you possessed. The person you were before the block was gone, too. She was softer, more trusting, perhaps more naive. The person you were now was harder, sharper, and carried the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you were capable of immense, focused force when provoked. It was a dark gift, but a gift nonetheless. The story of the block and the invites, of the cheese and the fake party, of the poisoned romance and the professional sabotage, was ultimately a story about the weight of a single action. He had pressed a button, a simple, effortless gesture, and set in motion a chain of events that dismantled his entire life. It was a modern fable, a cautionary tale for the digital age. It asks the question, do you truly understand the power you wield when you dismiss someone? Do you know what reservoirs of strength you might be tapping into? It's a reminder that karma isn't always a passive force. Sometimes, it has a blueprint. Sometimes, it wears a quiet smile and knows exactly where you hide your spare key. So, what is the moral of this story? Is it that revenge is a dish best served cold? Perhaps. But it's also that the quietest waters often run the deepest, and that the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming, the one you convinced yourself didn't matter. It's a story about the illusion of control in a connected world, and the profound, lasting cost of treating people as disposable. Now, I have a question for all of you. In a world where ghosting and blocking have become the standard exit strategy, where do we draw the line between protecting our own peace and accounting for the humanity of the person on the other side of the screen? Is there an action so small, so digitally insignificant, that it can't possibly carry the seed of monumental consequence? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, everyone has their story, and sometimes, the quietest ones are the most explosive.